Okay, so it is my great pleasure to introduce Jonathan Birch. Jonathan is Associate Professor at the London School of Economics, which in fact is called, I think, the London School of Economics and Political Science, something like that?
Officially.
Officially. Anyway, everybody knows it by LSE or London School of Economics. Jonathan is a philosopher specialized in philosophy of science and philosophy of biology more specifically. He wrote a book at Oxford University Press called Philosophy of Social Evolution. The book was praised by many eminent persons in the field as being a very, very important book, including by Kim Sterling, for example. You know Kim Sterling because he spoke in this seminar series at the beginning of the year. Jonathan has publications both in science journals and philosophy of science journals, in the best ones, in fact, and we thought it was, of course, important to emphasize this. Jonathan just started in January an ERC-funded project on the foundations of animal sentience, and we were just talking before the seminar about the fact that Jonathan is one of the very few philosophers in the world who is involved in designing experiments. So maybe we'll learn more about that, about bees, and Jonathan is directly involved in interactions with scientists to design those experiments. What else did I want to say? That the project started, Jonathan is going to hire some postdocs, so if you know people interested in both biology and philosophy that could be interested, if you could be interested in this, you can contact Jonathan for that. Today, Jonathan is going to talk about the search for invertebrate consciousness. The floor is yours, Jonathan. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be speaking at a Phil in Biomed seminar, because this idea of philosophy in biology and medicine is so central to my own work. It's a wonderful, important initiative that Thomas has put together. It's really central to my new project as well, Foundations of Animal Sentience, that I'm going to be talking about today. The project has literally just started in January, not even hired the postdocs yet. It's at a very early stage, so there's no results as such. There's no data as such. What I'm going to be talking about in this talk is the problem that motivates me and motivates the project, and the strategy for finding a solution. And in short, the goal of the project is to construct solid conceptual and methodological foundations for the science of animal sentience or consciousness. And I'll use those terms sentience and consciousness interchangeably in this talk. It's a very hard problem because sentience or consciousness is inherently subjective. To be sentient or conscious is to have subjective experiences. It's to have a subjective point of view on the world and on your own body. It's to be the sort of thing so that when events happen, they feel like something from your point of view. So for example, imagine that I throw a ball across a field. There'll be some objective description of the physical processes as the ball flies through the air, but there won't be anything that it feels like from the ball's point of view. But now imagine a dog chasing the ball across the field. Again, there'll be an objective description of the physiological processes as the dog runs after the ball. But in addition to all of that, there'll also be something it feels like from the dog's point of view, something it's like to be the dog. And that's what makes the dog conscious and the ball not conscious. Now, this is a notoriously difficult thing to study scientifically, the subjective side of the mental. Many of the problems here are brought out in Thomas Nagel's famous, widely cited paper, What is it like to be a bat? And that example of the bat is really well chosen for Nagel's purposes, because bats are close enough to us phylogenetically for us to all readily accept that there is something it feels like to be a bat, flying around, moving through the world, echolocating. We readily accept that the bat is conscious, it has feelings of some kind. But because it has this sense modality, echolocation, that is so radically different from the way that we navigate the world, so radically different from our own senses, we immediately struggle with that puzzle of what it feels like from the bat's point of view to echolocate, to get around the world in that way. The sort of cases that I'm most interested in are a bit different. In particular, I'm interested in invertebrates like bees, where the situation is rather the reverse of that, where if it feels like anything to be a bee, the sense modalities are broadly similar, because bees, as we do, navigate the world using vision. Vision is incredibly important for them, and olfaction. But they're so far from us phylogenetically. They're not mammals, they're not even vertebrates. We're separated by 500 million years of evolution, so far from us in the evolutionary tree of life, that there's real debate about whether an animal like this is conscious at all, whether an animal like this feels anything. And there's a debate going on with two sides. On the one hand, you ask, is there anything it feels like to be a bee? Some people will say, yes, of course there is. And you have people like Andrew Barron and Colin Klein in their paper, What Insects Can Tell Us About the Origins of Consciousness. And insects have the capacity for subjective experience, making that case. We also have Michael Tye in his recent book, Tent Bees and Shell-Shocked Crabs, making that case. Then you have a camp that says no. A bee only has 1 million neurons in its brain compared to 100 billion in ours. Bees are incredibly simple. They don't do anything that a robot could do. Insects cannot tell us anything about the subjective experience or the origin of consciousness, say some of those critics. Also a paper by a philosopher, Sean Allen Hermanson, in 2008, arguing that bees are sort of natural zombies in the philosopher's sense. Complex beings that feel like nothing from the inside. And you have entomologists as well, like Shelley Adalmo, saying we're not really talking about consciousness when we're talking about insects. Insects still looking like zombies. There's no agreement, but also, perhaps more fundamentally, there's no agreement on the kind of methodology that could settle a debate like this. What is it we're supposed to be looking for when we look for consciousness in bees? Given that if there is consciousness there, it is not going to be underpinned by the same neural mechanisms that it is in us. Bees' nervous systems are organized in an extremely different way. We can't look for a cortex, for example. There is no cortex. So what should we look for? And this problem is not just restricted to bees. It's going to arise in case after case where we can't be sure the animal is not conscious, but we know that if it is conscious, the mechanisms are going to be extremely different to the mechanisms that are there in mammals. So you get debate not just about insects, but debate about octopuses. Peter Goffey-Smith's book, Other Minds, weighs into that debate. You get debate about fish as well, even though they're vertebrates. And you get debate about decapod crustaceans, crabs and lobsters. A debate with great moral significance and significance for ethics, because ultimately you might think that whether these animals deserve protection, whether they should be included in the scope of animal welfare law, depends on whether they feel anything or not. Depends on whether they're conscious or not. In this talk, say something about the way I think about what a solution to this problem looks like. And the discussion's going to proceed via a kind of dialectic in which I talk about 3 broad types of solution. I'm going to call theory heavy, theory neutral, and theory light. The general shape of the talk is that I'm going to present reasons for thinking that the theory heavy approach is not very promising, and I'm going to present reasons for thinking that the theory neutral approach is not very promising either. And I'm going to use those considerations to try and motivate a middle ground path, an attempt to go between those extremes that I call the theory light approach. I asked Google Translate how it would translate middle ground, and it came up with le juste milieu, which I thought was wonderful. I might even adopt that as the name of the view. So here are the 3 approaches. I mean, the theory heavy approach is this. First, we find a theory of consciousness in humans. And then we take our best supported theory of consciousness in humans off the shelf, so to speak, and we just apply it to settle disputes about consciousness in bees or crabs or octopuses. This is a strategy that, for example, has been advocated by Daniel Dennett in the 90s, who wrote, "How could we ever explore these maybes, the maybes about which animals are conscious and which are not? Well, we could do so in a constructive, anchored way by first devising a theory that concentrated exclusively on human consciousness, the one variety about which we'll brook no maybes or probablys, because humans can tell us verbally what they're experiencing. And then look and see which features of that account apply to which animals and why." This can be contrasted with a totally different kind of approach, the theory-neutral approach that says, no, whatever you do, don't assume a theory of consciousness, because the theories we have at the moment, they're wildly speculative. There's no agreement at all. They differ massively from each other. We need to try and find a way of settling questions about animal consciousness without presupposing a theory, because if we presuppose a theory, you're only ever going to convince a small minority of people. What we should be doing instead is building up a list of behavioral, functional, anatomical similarities, finding as many similarities as we can between ourselves and between other animals. And we should then use this list, perhaps through arguments from analogy or inferences to the best explanation, to try and settle these disputes about consciousness in non-human animals. I think ultimately neither of those approaches is really going to work. We need something that is a halfway house between them, a middle path, the theory-light approach. But first of all, I'll explain why I don't find theory-heavy approaches very promising. And then I'll explain why I don't find theory-neutral approaches very promising either, using some examples from the literature. First of all, theory-heavy approach. Well, one thing that immediately comes to mind if you're trying to develop a theory-heavy approach to animal consciousness is the global workspace theory, developed by Bernhard Berlin and by Stanislas Dehaene, French neuroscientist, popularized in this book, Consciousness and the Brain, deciphering how the brain codes our thoughts. Probably the most eminent, most prominent theory of consciousness in humans in the contemporary literature. What does this theory say? Well, the short version is that it says in humans, information is consciously experienced when it enters what's called the global workspace, which is this sort of integrating network that takes in inputs from a wide variety of different sense modalities and then outputs or broadcasts to a wide range of consumer systems. Here's a figure from one of Dehaene et al.'s papers, where they help you to visualize this idea by saying, well, imagine this network centered on the prefrontal cortex in the human brain, but connecting out to lots of other different brain areas, where you have evaluative systems coming in, long-term memory coming in, perceptual systems, attentional systems, and then integrative stuff happens in this workspace, and then it outputs to motor systems and to all kinds of other systems, including things like language, verbal rapport. Can we take this theory and use it to say which animals are conscious or not? Can we just say, do they have a global workspace, for example? Well, probably not. The reasons why not, I think, are well articulated by Peter Carruthers in a new book he has called Human and Animal Minds. The basic problem that Carruthers raises, the theory-heavy approach based on global workspace theory, which he thinks is an excellent theory, by the way, is this, that when we look at non-human animals, what we'll never find is the entire global broadcast network that we find in humans. We'll only ever find partial similarity. The input systems will vary, and the consumer systems will vary too. And in particular, there'll be some consumer systems, like he thinks the language module and the mind reading or theory of mind module, he thinks won't be there in any other species. There might be some bits of it that are uniquely human, and then other bits that just gradually fall away as you get further and further away from humans. So a theory-heavy approach has to answer the question, which parts of that network that are there in humans are indispensable for generating conscious experience, and which parts are dispensable, which parts could be knocked out, still leaving conscious experience intact. And the problem is that, well, one way to read the theory is as saying nothing about this, that it's simply saying, in healthy adult humans, this entire network is sufficient for consciousness. And if that's what it's saying, then it's telling us nothing about non-human animals at all. There's another way to read the theory on which, well, maybe it does say something. Maybe you can add some propositions to the theory saying these bits are dispensable and these bits are indispensable. But then the concern is that evidence that is drawn purely from humans won't support those parts of the theory. They won't support any claims about which bits are dispensable and which are not. So the theory, if it starts talking about these bits being essential or indispensable and these bits being optional, will immediately start to go beyond its human evidence base. And you might react to that in various ways. I mean, Carruthers uses this to motivate an extremely radical view, which is that we should simply stop talking about animal consciousness. We should simply stop inquiring. He thinks global workspace theory is really good as a theory of consciousness in humans, but it tells us nothing about consciousness in non-human animals, so let's just stop inquiring. For me, that's not an acceptable solution. As I emphasized at the beginning, I think questions of real ethical importance turn on whether non-human animals are conscious or not, and which ones are conscious and which are not. So it's not an option for me to say, let's just stop inquiring. But I also don't think Carruthers succeeds in motivating that radical view. I don't have time to go into the detail, though, about why I think Carruthers is wrong. But a more modest reaction to this is to say, well, maybe let's try another theory. Let's try a different theory, not global workspace theory, but something else. And this is the approach that Barron and Klein take in their papers on subjective experience in insects. They take a different theory, a theory due to neuroscientist called Bjorn Merker, a theory that says the mechanisms that support conscious experience are not actually centered on prefrontal cortex at all. They're not even in the cortex anywhere. They're actually in the midbrain. The theory is that the low-level integrative mechanisms of the midbrain, in particular the superior colliculus, are sufficient for conscious experience even if there's no cortex there at all. I don't have time to explain the entire anatomy of the vertebrate brain, but basically here is a schematic diagram of what vertebrate brains look like. And here is the superior colliculus. It's a bit in the midbrain. Merker says that bit is by itself sufficient for conscious experience, even if there's no cerebrum at all. And Barron and Klein endorse that theory. They say, yeah, that's a good theory. Merker makes a good case for it in his paper on consciousness without a cortex. And they say, well, if Merker's right, applying that theory to insects, we have a strong case for thinking that insects are conscious. Because we have a strong case for thinking that insects have mechanisms that are closely analogous to the superior colliculus. They have mechanisms that are closely analogous to those of the vertebrate midbrain in what they call the central complex. Here's the bee brain. As you can see, it looks completely different from the vertebrate brain. It's a total disaster to try and map bits onto other bits on the basis of anatomy. But they say we can map them functionally. And the superior colliculus has this role of basically controlling orienting behaviors, bringing information together from different sense modalities and from both eyes, and using it to control fairly low-level orienting behaviors in relation to external objects as you kind of move through the world. And Barron and Klein say central complex is doing the same thing in the bee brain. It's gathering information from a variety of different sensory inputs. It's producing a basic model of the bee in its environment, and it's using that model to guide motion, just like the superior colliculus is. That's the basic outline of the case they try to make for bee consciousness and insect consciousness. More generally, this too has problems. It's problems because Well, if you look at the evidence that Merker gives for thinking that the midbrain alone is sufficient for conscious experience, the evidence, I think, is quite weak. And in particular, it's really quite weak compared to the sort of evidence-based case that defenders of global workspace theory try to make. How does Merker argue that even without a cortex, conscious experience is still possible? Well, no good looking at healthy adult humans who have a functioning cortex. What Merker does instead is he looks at patients with hydranencephaly, form of anencephaly, where really these are children who tragically have basically no cortex. The cortex has been almost completely destroyed. And his case in the 2007 paper is based on observations of those patients. And it's based on interviews with their carers, looking through lots and lots of dialogue from the carers. And he tries to make a case that these children who were born with no cortex, they're still conscious. And the case takes the form of, well, they can still orient themselves to their surroundings, and they can still apparently express emotion. It seems as though if they see a sibling, for example, they will express emotion, they will be happy to see their sibling. But this case Merker makes has been heavily criticized, including in the commentaries to that 2007 article in Behavioral and Brain Sciences. Behavioral and Brain Sciences publishes about 20 or 30 commentaries with each article. Usually, they're kind of like adverts for the person writing the commentary. Should have cited my work, here's a bunch of citations to my own work. But sometimes they're making really incisive critical points. And some of those commentaries on Merker do make pretty incisive critical points. They say, first of all, that with these patients with anencephaly, there may well be remaining cortical tissue in most of these cases. It's often very difficult to tell. Merker has to argue that that remaining cortical tissue is not enough to explain the apparently consciousness-linked behavior. It's very hard to make that case when you're looking at tiny numbers of patients. Another key criticism is that Merker has to somehow explain away the phenomenon of blindsight, which is an amazing phenomenon really in consciousness science, that patients with certain kinds of brain damage to the visual cortex, the back of the head, the outer edge of the back of the head, sometimes have this phenomenon where they report they can't see anything in a particular region of the visual field. So for example, they might say, I cannot see anything to the right of my hand here, can't see my hand. But then if you make them do a forced choice task, dependent on a stimulus that is in that field, so press like there's an arrow that appears in that region of the visual field, and you press one button that is pointing right, another button that is pointing left, something like that. And you force them to make a choice, they can get it right better than chance. So there's information coming in there to subcortical regions of the brain, and it's guiding behavior, but they are absolutely adamant that they're having no experiences, they're having no conscious experience in that region of the visual field. And for neuroscientists, that points very strongly towards some role for the visual cortex to generating conscious visual experience in humans. And Merker has to explain that away somehow, as he tries to do in the paper. The big problem for Barron and Klein is that, well, a lot of people aren't convinced by Merker's original evidence. And if you're not convinced by the human evidence base for his theory, there's no way you'll be convinced by its extension to insects. And that's why people like Adamo, who've criticized that paper, are not convinced. I think these two cases, these two, as I see it, failures of the theory-heavy approach, the global workspace theory and Merker's midbrain theory, they point towards a kind of wider lesson. A wider lesson that I call the dilemma of demandingness. So if you're constructing a theory of consciousness, you face this basic dilemma of how demanding you're going to make the requirements of the theory. The scientific theories of consciousness, they're usually aspiring to provide sufficient conditions for consciousness. They're not really saying that the mechanisms they describe are necessary, but they're trying to make a claim that they're sufficient, that they're enough you can make those sufficient conditions very demanding, which is what global workspace theory does. It says basically you've got to have a prefrontal cortex, and it's got to be doing very sophisticated integrative stuff and broadcasting to a very wide range of consumer systems, including things like language and theory of mind. Those sets of sufficient conditions are plausibly sufficient because they're so demanding, and there's good empirical support for thinking that they are sufficient. So when something enters the global workspace, it will be consciously experienced. But they don't get us very far with animals, where inevitably non-human animals are not going to meet the full set of conditions. They're not going to have the full set of mechanisms in quite the way we do. But then your alternative is to try and make the sufficient conditions much less demanding, and say maybe prefrontal cortex isn't needed, maybe not even any cortex is needed, maybe a midbrain is enough, maybe the superior colliculus is enough. Those sufficient conditions are now much less demanding than they were before. They can be much more easily met by a wide range of non-human animals, including fish, maybe even including insects. But the human evidence base that was supposed to lead us to believe that theory in the first place is inevitably much weaker, because the evidence has to come from subjects who are severely brain damaged and have lost essentially the entire cortex. This dilemma and the problems to which it leads, I think, naturally start to lead you to wonder, what if we could just do without committing to a theory? What if we could study animal consciousness without committing in advance to a theory of what consciousness is? Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that be a brilliant thing for the field? And that leads us towards the theory-neutral approach, an approach that tries to avoid committing to any theory of what consciousness is in advance. Ty's book, 10 Bees and Shell-Shocked Crabs, is a very good illustration of someone trying to take that approach. Ty has himself defended a theory of consciousness in the 90s that he called the panic theory. But in this book, he doesn't commit to that theory. He says, my theory might be right, it might be wrong, but I'm going to try and convince you that a wide range of animals are conscious without saying whether any particular theory is right or wrong. How does he do that? Well, he relies on a principle that he calls Newton's rule in the book, because he credits it to Isaac Newton. Not a Newton scholar, so I don't know if that's true or not. He also sometimes calls it the same effect, same cause rule. He says, well, in general in science, when we find similar effects, we should try to attribute them to similar causes. That's the idea he claims is there in Newton. And when it comes to animal consciousness, we should apply the same principle, that we should look for similarities of behaviour, and when we find similarities of behaviour, we should assume, unless shown otherwise, that their causes are basically the same as they are in us. So he says, suppose that humans and non-human animals engage in the same or very similar behaviour B, given the same noxious stimulus S. Suppose, for example, that we touch a hot plate and we recoil and nurse the finger. We see some animal doing the same thing with its own limbs. We ask, why do humans produce that behaviour, given that stimulus? Because it elicits a feeling of pain in them. The feeling of pain causes the behaviour. Turning now to the case of non-human animals, I'm entitled to infer that the feeling of pain causes the behaviour in them too, unless I have a defeater to that inference. That is a reason to believe that the causal story is operative in those animals that cannot be reconciled with the causal story that adverts to pain. He says this simple principle is enough to entitle us to attribute conscious experience to crabs, to bees, to fish, to a very wide range of animals indeed. He thinks it's really a version of common sense. Well, I don't think the problem is that easily solved. I don't think this approach really leads anywhere. The problem as I see it is with this idea that unless I have a defeater to that inference. Now he has to put this in. He has to put this in because otherwise basically anything goes. Any behaviour that involves recoiling from a noxious stimulus could lead to an attribution of pain without that defeaters clause. So we might end up saying, well, nematodes, 1 millimetre worms with 302 neurons, I mean, they recoil from noxious stimuli. They detect noxious stimuli and behave in response to them. Protists, amoebas, plants, even plants will react to noxious stimuli in various ways. So to avoid a kind of credulousness where now we're just uncritically attributing consciousness to basically every living thing, Ty has to put in this clause about defeaters. There have to be things that could defeat that inference, like perhaps the total absence of a nervous system might be a defeater for the inference. But then the approach to really be fully specified, he needs to say something about what the defeaters are. How do we specify what the defeaters are without running into the same old problems we've come across already? What does Ty have to say about this? Well, he considers one case. He says, what if someone comes along and says, well, the absence of a cortex is a defeater? Cortex, extremely well developed in humans, there in other mammals, but not really there in non-mammals, not there in fish. Birds, there's debate about whether they have regions homologous to the cortex. Ty argues, no, it's not a defeater. If it was a defeater, we'd be stuck with just mammals. We'd only be entitled to infer consciousness in mammals. So it had better not be a defeater given his name, his aims. But why shouldn't we think it's a defeater? Given that all the mechanisms in humans, for example, when we feel pain, all those mechanisms run through the cortex. So why shouldn't it be a defeater? He cites Merker's evidence in support of that claim. He says it shouldn't be a defeater because of these patients with anencephaly, who nevertheless seem to show consciousness-linked behaviors. So his implicit principle is something like this, that to show that the absence of some feature is not a defeater, what we need to do is find evidence in humans showing that brains without that feature still have sufficient conditions for conscious experience. And if that's the implicit principle, then this approach is not solving the problems of the theory-heavy approach at all, it's just concealing. Because, I mean, if we can implement this principle, we also have what we need to support a theory of consciousness like Merker's. So there's no gain there on the approach taken by Merker. And those concerned about the reliability of Merker's evidence, those who think it's a pretty weak case, really, because it just relies on a small number of patients with severe brain damage, will still be unconvinced by the role given to it by Ty. And Ty in the book doesn't even consistently apply this principle. So you might think, okay, if absence of a cortex is not a defeater, maybe that gets us to fish, because fish still have the vertebrate midbrain intact. But it wouldn't really get us to crabs or bees. Because crabs and bees, they have a completely differently organized nervous system. And Ty at that point just seems to forget the idea that he's supposed to consider defeaters. He doesn't even consider the possibility that total absence of the architecture of the vertebrate brain, including the vertebrate midbrain and hindbrain and forebrain, could be a defeater. He just forgets about defeaters totally at that point and essentially becomes credulous. So the theory-neutral approach has big problems as well. It leads to the charge of being unscientific, it leads to the charge of being just credulous, being far too willing to attribute consciousness on the basis of quite shallow evidence. I think that the wider lesson here is the inescapability of theory, in that to avoid credulousness, a theory-neutral approach to animal consciousness needs some grip on the defeaters, on the minimum requirements, on the reasons for excluding plants and bacteria, things like that. To get that grip, the approach needs a background theory after all. There's no easy way to escape theoretical commitments in this area. So we have a dialectic at this point with a kind of whirlpool and a rock. The rock is the dilemma of demandingness. It seems to be a problem for any theory-heavy approach to animal consciousness. And the whirlpool is the inescapability of theory. It kind of spits us back out in the direction of the rock. Can we find a way between those two problems? Can we find a middle ground approach that will avoid those two problems? I certainly hope we can. I think we can. It's an approach that I'm currently pursuing that I call the theory-light approach. It's theory-light because it doesn't make really substantive, weighty theoretical commitments, like a fully specified theory of consciousness would. But it doesn't try to be completely theory neutral. What it does is make one big commitment that is compatible with a wide range of fully specified theories, and that I think could command quite widespread support from consciousness researchers despite all of their disagreement about which theory is correct. So we start with a hypothesis compatible with a wide range of background theories. What I have in mind is an idea I call the facilitation hypothesis. This is not a theory of consciousness, but it is a big commitment. It's the idea that conscious perception of a stimulus facilitates, relative to unconscious perception, a cluster of cognitive abilities in relation to that stimulus. So there's a cluster of cognitive markers that we can look for, cognitive abilities that are linked to conscious perception of a stimulus, and that switch on, as it were, when a stimulus is consciously perceived. Things that a healthy adult human can do that someone with blind sight could not do, for example. Something that we can do when stimuli are consciously perceived as opposed to when they are masked, when they're presented subliminally, too fast for us to consciously perceive them. What kind of abilities could those be? Well, here, step 2 in the theory-light approach is to use evidence from humans, so we're not ignoring humans completely. We're using evidence from humans to develop hypotheses about what those cognitive abilities are. Here in the literature we find quite a few suggestions. I don't have time to talk about all of them. Basically quite a few forms of learning have been suggested to be linked to conscious perception, and forms of integration and forms of metacognition. Let's give one particularly striking example. There's work by 2 psychologists called Clark and Squire in the 1990s that was about a particular form of learning called trace conditioning. So in classical conditioning, you have your conditioned stimulus and your unconditioned stimulus, and they're presented together. An animal learns to associate the two things. So sort of a noise might be presented together with a food reward, and animal learns association between them. In trace conditioning, the conditioned and the unconditioned stimulus are separated by a temporal gap. So you have one thing, and then you have another thing a second later, or a few seconds later. So it's this gap in time. Clark and Squire's experiments were using trace eye blink conditioning, which is this long-established paradigm where you give someone a stimulus, like a tone in their ear, or a visual stimulus, and then a second or a few seconds later, they get a puff of air in their eyeball. And that puff of air at the eyeball is not very nice. It's aversive. So the question is, can humans learn that the tone will predict the puff of air in the eye? And can you learn to blink? Can you learn to blink a second after the tone? So you hear the tone, let a second pass, and then blink, and you avoid the blast of air in your eye. Clark and Squire's results was that humans can learn this, as you'd expect, but they can only learn it when they were consciously aware of the stimuli and the temporal relation between them. So if they were given a distracting task, and then afterwards they reported, I never heard that tone, or if they reported, I did hear the tone, but I wasn't aware of how much time passed between the tone and the blast of air. If they lack that awareness of the relation between the two stimuli, they cannot learn the association. They don't blink. They keep getting the blast of air in their eye. It's a striking result that's led to this idea that trace conditioning is linked to consciousness in humans. It's an example of an ability that is facilitated by consciousness. Consciousness has some sort of function relating to helping us learn temporal relations in time between things that are separated. Now, if that was all we had, if we just had one cognitive ability linked to consciousness, a case for consciousness in bees based on that would inevitably be quite weak, because it would be just all hanging on this one thing. We need to do better than that. We need to not hang it all on this one thing, but try and develop this whole package of abilities that evidence from humans suggests are linked to consciousness. So we have principled reasons to think that consciousness is facilitating these things. And then step 3 of the theory-light approach is to go and see whether the bees, or whatever our target species is, has those abilities. Can bees do trace conditioning? Can they do second-order conditioning, rapid reversal learning, cross-modal integration of novel stimuli, generalizable metacognition, etc., for all of the abilities we find? And then step 4, we got to that stage, we'd be starting to put a case together. We'd be starting to put together a cognition-based case for consciousness in this animal. Because we've got all these abilities that we have reason to believe are facilitated by conscious perception in humans, and we would have found those abilities in the bees. But the case could still be strengthened yet further. Could be strengthened yet further by showing that that package of abilities all switches on and off together, just as it does in humans. So in humans, if those stimuli never reach consciousness, if they are masked or presented subliminally, or if there's blind sight or whatever, those abilities all switch off together. We could find that too in the bees. We could find a way of switching off all of these things all at once by masking the stimulus in some way. That would make an even stronger case. The thought is that the presence of that cluster of cognitive abilities, plus the same pattern of sensitivity to masking, so if you give the bees a distracting task, perhaps, they can't do any of those things, just as a human would not be able to do any of those things when given a distracting task, or when the stimulus was masked in some other way. We have the basis for a rigorous inference to the best explanation, one that was not based on committing to a detailed theory in advance, but one that also wasn't credulous, that was just based on surface behaviour. A case based on cognitive abilities we have reason to think are linked to consciousness. It would show us that our target species has a mechanism that facilitates the same cluster of abilities under relevantly similar conditions as conscious experience in humans. I tend to think that that's probably the strongest sort of case that we could possibly make for conscious experience in a bee. Because we're never really going to be able to make a case based on neuroanatomy. It's not going to happen. What we can do is make a case based on cognition that is serious and that is going to be much more convincing than a case based solely on surface behaviour. So that's what I'm trying to do at the moment. That's what I'm trying to do over the next 5 years. At the moment, I don't think we have the basis for this, for a case like this in any invertebrate. Not even in bees, which are one of the most studied types of invertebrate. We take honeybees as our focal example here. Their learning abilities have been intensively studied, but not systematically with a view to consciousness-linked abilities. So there was one attempt to find trace conditioning, but it was looking at olfaction, and with olfaction it's incredibly hard to tell that the conditioned stimulus has actually gone. So it's very challenging to show trace conditioning with olfaction. So there's always a skeptic who might say, what if the scent is still there? How can you be sure it's not still there? Second order conditioning, one study. Reversal learning is the most well established. Reversal learning is when you learn one association and then it's reversed. So for example, if an arrow cued a stimulus on this side in the first half of the experiment, it's then switched around so that now it cues a flash of light on the other side. That sort of thing has been studied with bees quite a lot, and they're very good at it. Cross-modal integration, you could find one study about generalizable metacognition. Metacognition has been studied a bit, but its generalizability has not been studied very much. So these things suggested in the literature as cognitive abilities linked to consciousness have not been studied very much in bees. And what hasn't been studied at all is this question of whether there is a way of intervening on the stimulus to switch all of these abilities on or off at the same time, a form of masking. So those are the sorts of things that I'm looking at with my scientific collaborators. Lars Chitko in his wonderful bee lab at Queen Mary in London, and also Ellie Ledbetter another wonderful bee lab at Royal Holloway in London. The London School of Economics has no labs at all, has no biology department. But in London we have wonderful labs studying bee cognition that I'm working with to try and assemble a case for consciousness in bees. It's not because I'm specifically obsessed with bees, but rather that I think bees are a great place to start if we're thinking about this question of how one might try to make a case for consciousness in any invertebrate species. And the hope is that, well, if we can make a good case for bees, maybe that's the first step towards making a good case for decapod crustaceans like crabs and lobsters, for example, or flies, or spiders, or any other invertebrate. For the moment then, if we return to our original question, is there anything it feels like to be a bee? Well, I really suspect there is. Conjecture that there is. Well, I don't think we can give a confident answer just yet. What I have done is provide reasons to think that despite the serious problems with previous attempts to resolve this debate, despite the fact the debate carries on, I don't think it's irresolvable. I don't think it's the sort of debate that could not possibly be resolved by empirical evidence, as some might argue. I think there is evidence that bears on this question, evidence that we can look for, evidence that we can find. What's needed is not more grand theories of consciousness. What's needed is also not more kind of undirected data gathering based on just looking at surface behavior. What's needed is a systematic search for consciousness-linked cognitive abilities with the facilitation hypothesis guiding it. And ideally a way of testing the sensitivity of these abilities to masking, seeing if they switch on and off together. And if we did that, we would then have, I think, a strong empirical case for thinking that there's something it's like to be a bee. Thanks very much for your attention.